Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm here with another palettes on the shopping block series. I have been doing this kind of series where I drip out my own collection. I go through each palette on my shopping block and I want to see what else I have in my collection that's similar. So I do have a couple of palettes I will cover today. First up, before I go into the actual comparison, I do have two palettes right here, which are these two Colourpop palettes. So these two are both on my shopping block, but I won't cover them in the video. First up, we have the Aha Honey palette, which is a monochromatic yellow palette. I don't really have anything else that's monochromatic yellow. Yes, I would be able to pull like maybe one or two shades, or maybe three even, from other palettes, but I won't be able to dupe out the whole palette. And the reason why this is on the shopping block is because it is a monochromatic palette and not because like I'm not inspired by the color story. It's because I'm doubtful I need all of these yellows. So basically that's why it's on there. So I won't go through this one. And then the second one is the At First Sight palette, which looks like this. This is another one that I won't go through, mainly because I did actually use this one in my duping out the Subculture palette. And this one was basically my better version of the Subculture palette. So I already kind of decided that I want to keep this one rather than Subculture. And because of that, I won't cover this one. And I feel like the color stories are quite similar. They're not exact. But I did cover kind of similar palettes in that video, which was my first installment of this project. So I feel like it would be very redundant doing this one too, especially because I already kind of decided that I want to keep this palette. So those are the first two. So the two palettes that I will cover today are these two right here, which are two Natasha Denona palette. We have the Sunrise palette and the Love palette. So I will go through these two, but before I jump into that, if you're new here, please consider subscribing. I would love to have you in the family. Let's jump into the video. So here we have the first comparison. This is obviously the Sunrise palette from Natasha Denona, which is going to be one of the ones I compare. I'm going to start with this one and do the Love palette second. And then here we have the Pat McGrath Divine Rose 2 palette. So at first glance, there might not be a lot to overlap, but the more you look at it, at least in my opinion, I find more and more shades that are similar. So I have gone ahead and swatched out all of the shades. So you can see the comparisons here. Again, notice everything is exact, but there is a couple of shades that overlap. So I would say the main thing that we're missing is those kind of yellow tones, the yellow tone matte, like the mustards, not mustards really actually, more like canary yellows, like this bright like orangey yellow, like those aren't really in the Pat McGrath palette. There is like this gold though, and I was thinking if I want to put that next to this here, but that one is matte and this one is a shimmer, so I didn't want to compare those two. But yeah, I mean these two shades here are very, very similar, so are these two here. These two as well, and these two too, but this one is way more sparkly, which is the one from the Pat McGrath palette. It is one of her special shades, so it is going to be more sparkly. Also, you know, I would say these four right here are very, very similar. These two here are similar. I have compared this kind of purplish shade here to this purplish shade here, but that one is a little bit deeper, and it doesn't have the shift that the one in the Natasha Denona palette does, but otherwise quite similar. These two are very similar. It's the lightest shade in here and the lightest shade in there, or like this one here in the corner, as well as this one here in that corner. And then these two aren't exactly the same again. The Pat McGrath palette is again a little bit deeper. And then for the last comparison here, I wasn't sure about this one, but I wanted to compare this bright pink. I feel like in tone is close to this one, but this one is a matte and this one is more of a satin, so I wanted to compare it to one of these two. And this here, which is the first shade in the palette Poppy, is more pink toned, although it's not the same. So, you know, there is a lot of shades overlapping, not exact, but I do kind of get a similar vibe, especially like I said on this end here. It is more of these shades here that aren't exactly the same. So that is the first comparison. So the next palette I want to compare it to is the Sweet Talk palette from Colourpop. Just to note as well, these two shades here are switched out. They are normally pressed glitters, but I picked two similar shades in like regular shadow form that I've added in instead. So this here is the palette. There is a couple shades that are overlapping, less than in the last palette, but there is a couple shades, so let's go through them. So I would say these two here are very similar. This one is actually that brown. It looks way more brown there, but it does pull a little bit more kind of, you know, peachy toned, similar to this one. It's slightly deeper though. These two are basically spot on. It is this shade here and then this shade here, very, very similar. The two golds are similar, not the same though. The one in the Sweet Talk palette is definitely a bit more kind of yellow, almost green leaning, whereas this one is a bit more beige, but similar. These two are also very similar. I have decided to pair this shade here, which is Morgan, with this one here, but I feel like it would actually be like a mix between these two. So I would say that it's kind of covered, but you know, it's not exactly the same. You would have to like tweak the shades a little bit. Then up here we have these two. This one is like a duochrome, like a almost like a bronzy base with a pink shift. This one here is like a pink with a gold shift. So they give a similar vibe, but they're almost like opposites in the way they shift. But I wanted to compare them anyway. Then we have these two last here, which are like the lighter shade here, which is this one, as well as the shade Laurel here. They are very similar as well. I would say the Colourpop one is slightly more like icy, but otherwise quite similar. But, you know, there's a couple of shades. The peachy shades are definitely covered. However, like the pink parts of the palette and like the more yellow tone shades are not. So, you know, you get a little bit of the palette, but not all of it. So another Colourpop palette that I want to compare is this one here, which is the I Love Sarah E and Colourpop palette collaboration in Through My Eyes. This has been discontinued, but it's one that I love in my collection. I do feel like there's a lot of overlap here. This one does have a few more greens, but like if you look at shade by shade, there's actually more than you might think. So here are the comparisons, and as you can see, there's actually a lot of overlap. I would say in this palette, you definitely have those more pink tones, which I was missing in the last one. The only thing is like these more kind of pink tone shimmers we do not have in the Through My Eyes palette. But like the mattes, most of the mattes apart from this yellow is covered. Oh, sorry, in this peach or like this like light kind of creamsicle shade, I would say, are missing. But other than that, a lot of it is. This shade here is very similar. So this shade Nocturne is similar to Poppy and Phlox actually. But I always said like these two are very redundant. So instead of comparing it like with both of them, I compared this more red one with Phlox. I think that's how I say Phlox, right? Then for the rest three here, the shimmers, again, we don't have anything really similar. For Glory, we do have the shade Misbehave, which are very similar. This one is a little bit more purple leaning. This one is a little more like pink red, I would say, if anything, but it's very, very similar. These two are more similar than you might think. This one is actually the shade Nostalgia, which I always feel like is a mauve, but it's more of a, I don't know, like a peachy kind of tone. It's not like super mauvey. It's definitely a little bit more mauve than the one in the Sunrise palette though, which is the shade Morgan again. But, you know, similar shades. These two golds are very similar, so are these deepening up shades. Actually, a lot of these are very similar. This orange here is a little bit brighter than the one in the Colourpop palette, sorry, in the Natasha Denona palette, but again, similar. And then these here are similar as well. The one in the Colourpop palette has a little bit more of a red base, but very, very similar. So a surprising palette, I would say that I didn't really think would be that similar. But yeah, you can definitely see the similarities when they are swatched out. So the last like kind of big palette that I want to compare it to is this one right here, which is from Odin's Eye. This is also discontinued. This was the collaboration with It's Judy Time. It is the Red Dragon palette. So I wanted to compare these two because I feel like there is a little bit of a similar vibe, and I just want to swatch now to see just how similar they are. So these right here are the comparisons, and honestly I couldn't find too many shades that are similar. You have these two bronzes, whereas the one in the Red Dragon palette is a little bit more warm tone, but you know, similar shades. Here we have these two. This one here is the first shade in the Red Dragon palette. It's definitely more brown than this one is more kind of creamsicle. These two are quite similar, so are these two. The one in here in the Red Dragon palette is a little bit, I don't know, a little bit more kind of orange, whereas this one is a little bit more pink undertoned. And then these two are kind of similar, not the same. This one's definitely more shimmery, but there's definitely less shades in here than I thought that would be similar. So it's not the best comparison, but yeah, you do cover kind of more of the neutral tones, I would say, whereas the other ones are not. So that is the Red Dragon palette. Then a few honorable mentions. I have a couple palettes that I wanted to compare, but I'm not going to swatch them out because I don't feel like there's enough similar shades. Next up, we have this one here, which is my Kaleidos. I'm going to actually move them on here. The Kaleidos Sashimi City palette. I would say there's a lot of similar shades, but this one is only a 6 pan, whereas this one is 15, so I wouldn't cover the whole palette. Also, there's not really any browns, so the most similar shades would be these, like the two shimmers here, and then these two shades. But, you know, I don't think there's necessarily anything that's exact, so I wanted to mention it, but I don't think I'm going to swatch them out. Another palette is my Norvina palette from Anastasia. I would say, again, there's a couple of shades that might be similar, but this one is definitely more cool tone leaning, whereas this one is a bit more, like it's very warm, where like sunrise, sunset vibes. Whereas this one, like I said, is more cool tone. But there's a couple of shades that I can see that, you know, would give similar effects. But again, I'm not going to swatch them out. Then the last palette, which I feel like it might be the most similar out of the ones that I mentioned now, is this one here, which is the Elba palette from Odin's Eye again. So there's definitely a few shades here that I feel like are more similar. Like I feel like Camellia here is similar to Glory. Peony is similar to Clove. maybe it's even Morning Glory would be similar. I don't know. I would have had to swatch them out to see. You also have Cherry Blossom, which I feel like is similar to Acelia. And then you have like the yellows, which, you know, you have here too. So there's a little bit similar vibes, but again, I feel like this one is more mauve leaning, whereas this one is definitely more kind of rich reddish tones. But I did want to mention them, but I'm not going to swatch these palettes out. And here we have my dupe of the Sunrise palette. So I do think there's a little bit of differences here. I did also include some multi-chromes which aren't in the original palette, but I feel like it gives more variety to it. So these are the swatches right here, and let's go through each shade in order. So for the first kind of very similar shade, Poppy and Phlox, I have done 2 jeweled multi-chromes from Cleona. The first one here is Kiln, which is a little bit more kind of magenta. And then this one here is Sunblast, which is a little bit more, I don't know, like reddish orangey kind of leaning, but that's those two here. And in between there, we have this yellow, which is Geese Alain from Sydney Grace. So that's the first shades. Next up, we have this one here, which is from Terra Moons, and I think this is Cesium, right? No, Palladium, sorry. So that's the shade Palladium. It's not exactly the same as the shade Awakening, but I feel like it just gives a little bit more excitement to the palette, a little bit more variety again. So that's this one here. This shade here is from Pastel Roses. It's actually not, like, I don't have a name for it because I got it as a free gift with purchase for Black Friday, so I don't have a name for it, but I think that's quite similar. Next up, I feel like this is the perfect shade for Aster. This is the shade Gersai from Cleona. It's like the way more intense version of Aster, but yeah, that's the next shade. Oh, also, by the way, this is the first row right there. And then next on the second row, we have this one here, which is the shade Orchid from Terra Moons. Here we have the shade Crimson Eclipse from Terra Moons compared to Azalea. Then we have the shade Morgan, which I have compared to the Sydney Grace shade Footprints, which is this one here. And then lastly, we have Little Star, which is compared to Agate. I don't know how you pronounce that, but that is the second row right here. Then for the last row, we have first up a Sydney Grace shade, which is the shade Sweet Tooth here. Then we have a shade that was departed from the Nikki Tutorials and Beauty Bay palette. I can't remember what it's called now, but it's like this kind of shade in there. Then we have another Sydney Grace shade, I believe. This one is the shade Harvest here. Then we have the shade Chickadee from Makeup Geek here. And lastly, we have a Colourpop shadow, which is the shade Boozy. And that is the last row right there. So I do think I did a pretty good job. I do have definitely a lot of similarities. Some of these aren't exact, but I kind of like my version. It gives a little bit of sparkle, a little bit more shiftiness. So that is the comparison, and I think I did a pretty good job of duping this palette out. So that's all the comparisons I wanted to do for the Sunrise palette. I definitely feel like I have a couple palettes that give similar vibes. Before doing the swatch party, I didn't really think I would have anything similar to this palette. I feel like this would be quite unique with the rich kind of tones in here. But I can definitely see that I have these shades in other palettes. I just don't have them all together like I do in this one. If I'm being realistic, I probably won't declare this palette at the end of the year like I am with some other palettes on my shopping block, just because it is Natasha Denona, and I like being able to put this into singles and take them with me traveling. And yeah, I do like this palette. I feel like you get these more colorful shades here if you want to get a really nice sunset look, but also if you take these away, you do have a really nice kind of neutral color story right there, which I like playing around with, and even including like that shimmer right here. So these kind of 7 shades I feel like are quite neutral, but then you do have like those colorful shades as well. So I do really like this palette. Actually, it's one that has grown on me for sure this year. So right now I don't think I'm going to declutter it, but I'm going to sit on it until my actual following up video on my shopping block series, which will be at the end of the year, and you see what I decide to do. But again, realistically, I won't declutter this palette. So next up, we are comparing the Love palette, and I again pulled out the Divine Rose 2 palette from Pat McGrath because it does have some pinky tones as well. So I have swatched them out, and there's actually way less eyeshadows in here that are similar. Originally, I actually thought this palette would be more similar to the Love palette compared to the Sunrise palette, but looking at them, I feel like it's opposite actually, because, you know, these two here are compared, but this one is definitely more peachy, whereas this one is very pink. It's the shade Incense right here. These two are quite similar. This one is a little bit more bronzy though, whereas this one has a little bit more pink to it. I compared this bright pink to this shade here because it's like the most pink shimmer in the palette. However, I do feel like it would be quite similar to this one, but that one is a multi-chrome. Let me swatch it out here. I don't even know what kind of color you would see in the screen right now, but from where I'm sitting, it's like a murky kind of pink going into green. But yeah, it is a multi-chrome, so I didn't want to compare that necessarily. So that's why I decided to go with this more bright pink. These two shades are very similar. I mean, they use kind of the corner shades anyway. And these two mattes are very similar too, as well as the gold. But overall, not that many overlapping shades. I thought there would definitely be more. So the palette that I think is definitely closest to the Love palette is this one here, which is the Love Notes palette from Beauty Bay. It's actually quite funny because this palette is one that I see as like a really love palette for me. I love the romantic tones in here. I love how like light and romantic it is. But the Love palette, I always just find it really hard to use. And looking at them, they are actually quite similar. And I have swatched out all the shades. So these are the comparisons. Granted, some of these are definitely not exact, but I wanted to swatch out as many similar colors as I could just to see what the differences are. So down here we have the kind of the purple. This one here is definitely more pastel, but I feel like if you mixed in a little bit of this one, you could get an exact color. The pinks too aren't exactly the same. I feel like maybe actually this one is closer to this one. I don't know, but I just wanted to again find ones that are more comparable. This shimmer here, I don't really have anything in the Love Notes palette. It's nothing really as deep as this one, so I skipped over this one. And then for this more kind of murky pink, we have this one here and then this one in the corner here. But the one in the Love Notes palette is definitely more mauve, whereas this one is a bit more kind of warm pink. For the silvers, the one in the Love Notes palette is definitely more kind of pink toned silver, whereas the one in the Natasha Denona one is definitely like full on silver. For the dark shade here, we have the shade Commitment from the Natasha Denona Love palette, which is definitely more purple, whereas this one is just brown. It's not the best comparison, but again, I just wanted to cover them. For this one here, I didn't really have anything super similar either. This one is the shade Pure Love here. And I compare it to this shade here, which again isn't super similar, but I just want to compare these to see how they look. Then we have this shade here, which is the shade Confetti from the Love Notes palette compared to the shade Given. I feel like they are quite similar, not exact, but they give similar vibes. And then up here, we do actually have a lot of similarities. We have these purples, which I feel like are basically the same. These two as well are very similar. The one in the Love Notes palette is definitely more impactful though, but very similar. And then these two brownish kind of reddish tones are very similar again. I compared this shade here with the shade Heartbeat. And then the golds are similar, and then the setting shades are similar. So definitely a lot of similarities, but there's also a lot of things that aren't exact. But I do feel like I have, you know, similar vibes with this one. This one is a bit more purple leaning. This one is a bit more kind of pink leaning, I would say. And overall, the Natasha Denona Love palette goes a little bit deeper, but you know, there's definitely a lot of overlap here. The next palette we have to compare is this one here, which is the Jackie Aina palette from Anastasia. This one here has a lot of pink tones in this half of the palette, but this one here isn't very similar. But I have swatched out as many as I could that are similar, so let me have a look here. So as you can see again, it is a lot of pinks that are overlapping, like the more pinky tones. The first like 4 shades in this palette are all in here. We have Soleil here, we have Pinker here, we have Supreme here, Pinker here, and Big Wig here. Then for the kind of more warm tone shade here, we don't have anything. I did compare this warm brown, or the dark brown with this purple shade. Not the same, but you know, similar vibes. Then Credit I compared to the silver shade, but Credit is obviously more taupey and a bit deeper, but I wanted to compare them anyway. Then I compared Sam here with the gold, which I think is very similar. And I did actually compare Wiggly's, which is the red, with this one here, which isn't the same, but I just wanted to include them anyway. So the rest of the palette after that isn't included in the Love palette, but you know, actually this purple, I don't think it's going to be similar, but no, it's not similar at all. I just wanted to give it a go, but you can see the rest of the shades. So take away this one, I would say like that's kind of the shades that I would say are similar. Not the most, but a couple of shades. Funnily enough as well, the more pink tones in this palette is what I reach for the least. And it's kind of also showing that maybe I don't need this palette in my collection, but we'll see. So that is the Jackie Aina palette. So those are actually the only palettes that I will swatch out for this one. Yeah, there's not really anything else that I feel like it's going to have enough similar shades, but I do have a couple honorable mentions again. First up, we have this one here, which is the Paris Edit palette from Viseart. This one also have pink tones in it, and it does have some of the purple tones, but I feel like this one definitely has a different undertone. This one is more cool toned. And if you look shade by shade, I don't think there would be too many things that are exactly the same or similar enough to swatch out. I didn't want to compare these two because, again, I don't think it would be worth swatching them out because I would only find a couple of shades that are similar enough. But again, it does have those pinky tones. Another palette that I thought I would originally swatch out is this one here, which is the Carly Bible palette. This one Does again have like more kind of pink tones. It has this one here, which I feel like would be similar to maybe like one of these two shades. It does have this red, which one might be similar to this one. But again, if you look shade by shade, there's not too many overlapping shades. This one has more warm tones, especially in the mattes. And it doesn't have any of like the purple mattes, even the pink mattes. These ones are more peachy. So yeah, again, initially I thought these would be more similar, but looking at them like shade by shade, I don't think it was worth swatching out. Then we have the Mercury Retrograde palette, and again, similar thing. Initially I thought, okay, this one has like the purple tones, the mauve tones, like some golds, but looking at them shade by shade again, I don't think it is similar. This one is definitely kind of like, I don't know, more pastel-y, more, I don't know how to describe them. The undertones are different in this one for sure. This one is more kind of rosy red undertones, whereas this one doesn't have those undertones. I would say the only thing that's kind of funny is like the purpley shade here is more red leaning than this one in here, which, you know, would be opposite. But overall, I don't think there would be too many overlapping shades. Maybe like Vortex and Commitment would be similar. But again, I don't think it would be worth swatching out. And then the very final palette is one that I almost swatched out, but I decided not to, because again, when I look at it more one by one, I don't think there's too many similar shades, and that is the Nabla Dreamy palette. I would say Vanitas is probably similar to Lifetime, and you know, this shade here might be similar to, actually maybe Soul or Heartbeat, but I don't think they're exact. And that's kind of what happened, is I started looking shade by shade, and I don't think there's anything too similar. Maybe like Metal Cupid or Inception would be similar to Pure Love, but again, not too many things. And I think just looking at them initially, you're like, oh, well, you have those purple tones, you have the golds, and then the pinks. But when you look at them shade by shade, I don't think they're very similar. So that is the final palette. So here you have my dupe of the Love palette. So I think I did a decent job. I'm going to go ahead and show you the swatches on my arm. So these are the swatches. So some of these might look a bit different because they are multi-chromes, but I wanted to give some more pizzazz to this palette and still kind of keep the same vibe. So I feel like I did a decent job. So let's go through the shades in order. So first up, we have the shade Thirst compared to a potted NYX shadow. It was from the In Your Element Air palette. Then we have Glam Shop Bombawi. Here we have Sydney Gray's Piper's Pipin'. Then we have Sydney Gray's Versailles. And this one here is a Colourpop shade, and it's in the shade Silk Street, which was from the Element of Surprise palette. So that's the first row of the Love palette. Next up, we have this red, which is from Terra Moons, and I'm pretty sure it's Sangre. Yeah, it's Sangre. Then we have from the Pastel Roses, we have Marshmallow. Here we have from Cleona King's Feast. This one here is from Sydney Gray's, and it's the shade Love and Happiness. It's slightly more, like, less purple, but still similar vibes. And then lastly, we have Tiara from Sydney Gray's. So that is the second row right there. For the third and final row, we have Colourpop Blank Canvas. Then we have Cleona Forge, I think. Yes, Cleona Forge. Then we have another Colourpop shadow. This is the shade Dear. Then we have another Potter shade from that Element, In Your Element Air palette from NYX. It's just a light kind of peachy pink. And then lastly, we have the shade Wisteria from Makeup Geek, and that is the last row right there. So I feel like I did a pretty decent job. Some of the shades aren't exact, but they are pretty similar. And also for some of the shimmers, I wanted to do something a bit more exciting. So I did introduce some multi-chromes and duochromes, like this shade here, this here, this here, and this here. Those are all multi-chromes or duochromes. So I just wanted to give the shadows a little bit more fun. But yeah, I'm really happy with this dupe. So that is the Love palette. So with this palette, I'm probably leaning towards more like decluttering it compared to the Sunrise palette, if I had to like make a decision now. However, again, I do like these because you can take them out. You can make like your like own natural Chanel palettes, and also take them out as singles. And a lot of shades in here, if I looked at them one by one, I do really like. I like these pink tones. I love the like kind of more goldy shades. I love the shimmers. This shade Commitment I really do love. First, it's a really good like setting shade. Not that I use them too much, but like a blending shade. So looking at the shades one by one, there's a lot of things that I would like in here. I think what throws me off is maybe like the purpley tones, like the deepness, the silver maybe, I don't know. But there's something about this color story that just overwhelms me. Maybe I should try like rearranging the palette and playing around with it that way, because maybe it's the layout, I don't know. But for now, it is obviously going to stay, but I'm going to have to review it again at the end of the year just to see what I would decide to do. But that is the Love palette. And that, you guys, was it for today. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I do have a couple more in this series to go. Just looking at my list, I feel like I would have 2 more videos go up in the series, just judging from the amount of palettes that I have left. So you can look forward to a couple more videos like this, but I hope you're enjoying this concept. I got a little bit of feedback on it, and it seems like you are. I'm really enjoying this. It's really making me learn more about my collection and what I have and what I don't have. And it's also, I feel like, helping with my makeup consumption, because I have really, since started doing this, realized that I probably don't need as many new palettes as I thought. I am on an eyeshadow no-buy this year for the most part. I do have a couple exceptions, but yeah, I am on a no-buy. So I can't buy anything anyway, but I feel like when my no-buy is over, I'm not going to be as inclined to buy things, just judging from this project. But that is it for today, you guys. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Make sure to check out my next video that goes up, and I will catch you then. Bye!